Hi, all. We can get started. It's so nice to see so many people here. Thank you so much for spending part of your Saturday with us. I'm Hannah Zeven. I'm the founding editor of Parapraxis magazine and co-director with Alex Colston, who's here today, of the Psychosocial Foundation. We're hosted by these two new-ish groups. On the one hand, Parapraxis, a popular magazine of psychoanalysis on the left, and the Psychosocial Foundation, which with this event and your support is entering its second year. I encourage you all, if you feel like it, to sign up for our mailing address, which you can do on the bottom of our website, which is here. And you can consider also subscribing to Parapraxis. Also, you might want to come back for our next big event, which will be on love in March with a really great all-star crew. And also in just 2 weeks, we'll begin our, several months long seminar on questions of repair and irreparability, which is also the topic of Parapraxis's second issue. And you can sign up for these things or check them out via the links I just dropped in the chat. So today's event is, I think, as you all know, on The Body Keeps the Score. And we're going to hear from four truly brilliant panelists. Thank you so much for joining, who are historians and theorists, somatic practitioners, and artists. And we're going to hear from them in just a moment. I'm going to just offer a very few, I hope quite brief, framing comments about this book, because I know not everyone has read it, and yet it's this complete, object in our Geist. So trauma has been the signal concept of the 20th century, a testing ground for the mind-body connection and its constant revision of same. Trauma and its occurrences, its symptoms, and its cures have similarly branched over the last 100 years or so. As Ruth Lays writes in her titular book, Trauma, on trauma, the aim of some of these cures is to remember traumatic instances and to remember them anew with difference. For other cures, the aim is to practice forgetting. She writes, quote, "But like the aim of remembering, that of forgetting has a history," end quote. That trauma has a history as a concept, let alone our understandings of how to treat it, is a claim worth pausing over onto itself. Trauma as a definitional category at once bears the marks of the history of the mind sciences, of war, of gender, of race, of society, but it's also treated as a timeless and spaceless category. More recently, its definitional capacity, despite its extreme diagnostic power, has increasingly been maligned as over or misused, wiped out of its particulars. Modern trauma theory, its debates might find its ancestors in something like Charcot's work on hysteria in France in the late 1800s, and Freud's subsequent revisions that argued that instead of looking for a biological, documentable cause, we might just listen to the hysteric speak themselves. Freud at first thought that the hysteric patient was taking a quote unquote flight into illness after traumatic events, typically in his earliest work, sexual assault by male family members or social relations. Patriarchy was here, in essence, offered as the explanation for that widespread enough psychosomatic disorder, and it was understood to be psychosomatic. Others suggested wholesale modernity or technology was to blame. But after a pause, psychoanalytically inflected trauma theory was embraced once more at World War I, with Freud's work on war neurosis being disseminated heavily. Another pause. This is what Lays means by this repetition of remembering and forgetting. And again, psychoanalysts were called in to name and manage the traumas of World War II. This is that pattern that would repeat across the 20th century. During times of mass war, trauma theory would be consolidated, regulated, refined, reinvested in. And this is what it means, right, when we forget and we remember. It's only after the Vietnam War, with this new, narrow Anglophone definition in hand of trauma that we still apply here in the United States, that we start to see trauma move into domestic settings, both within the United States and, in fact, as it's exported beyond its borders. And under it, trauma, that slippery term for the cause of what is typically thought of to be psychosomatic conditions, became both accessible as a term for self-understanding and also ambiguous, ushered in with a series of powerful moves of consolidations produced in the DSM-3 in 1980. Frantz Fanon writes that we have to put the dream in its time. I would add that we also have to put the nightmare in its place. And so enter in 1984, Bessel van der Kolk, whose book is the subject of today's roundtable. His earliest works on the literal replay of the sleep of traumatic scenes were the flashbacks to traumata. And his work initiated in a sleep laboratory where he compared combat veterans from the Vietnam War to civilian anxiety dream havers, those who suffer from nightmares, night terrors. The civilians, he argued, didn't move. Their nightmares conformed to typical REM dreams. It was the combat veteran who tore off their wires, whose dreams were accompanied by bodily movements. And therefore, van der Kolk deduced that this was because veterans were reliving trauma mimetically, which was contrary to the neurological findings in the same moment. Yet this work was echoed elsewhere, as Lays will point out, in the memory wars occurring between Lays, Feldman, and also Kathy Carruth. This was also what had been argued 100 years prior with Charcot. So despite the controversy over van der Kolk's findings and an adjustment in the DSM-4 that softened language away from his stance on purpose and that of other trauma specialists in this moment, like Judith Herman, and I see Abby's here, and Abby's writing about Herman right now for Parapraxis issue 2, van der Kolk all but doubled down. He kept going. And the most famous icon of that double down, the result, was the 2014 book that we're gathered here to discuss, The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and the Body in the Healing of Trauma, which has spent more than 150 weeks subsequently on the New York Times bestseller list. Part of its popularity, undoubtedly, is that, in fact, it offers us a slogan, the body keeps the score. He took that general notion of a psyche, soma, when actually variously shunted by brain cures in that period. So it's a kind of radical revision, whatever you think of it. It goes against a dominant way of understanding the mind-body connection and presents the public with a way of understanding themselves through that connection. So the book is as beloved as it's controversial, and reading it is no easy task, as I think our panelists can attest to. It's centered and opens in the atrocities of the Vietnam War and moves very swiftly into recommendations that are highly technical and might be out of reach for many. And yet this book is, if any, is truly popular. So it demands, we think, attention and critical reconsideration. So today we're going to hear from these 4 brilliant panelists to that end. Thank you so much for joining us. And I will introduce them briefly in order of how they will appear. We'll then move to a kind of roundtable with the 4 panelists and then invite you all to join us in conversation. So first we'll hear from Angelica Clayton, a PhD candidate in the History of Science and Medicine department at Yale, who works at the intersection between psychology, histories of psychology, medicine, and information science in the US in the second half of the 20th century. Her dissertation is titled Traumatic Information, Interpersonal Violence and the Cybernetic Human. And I'm so excited to hear Angelica speak. Sumitra Rajkumar, who will go next, cut her movement building teeth in the racial justice uprisings of the mid-1990s in New York City. After a decade in popular education efforts with youth and co-producing media and documentary work, she's moved on to political education workshops with community organizers. While doing so, she trained in politicized somatics, a trauma-informed, body-based healing method that connects the personally embodied values to collective social transformation. She has since then applied her training to support left organizers, cultural workers, organizations, and collectives. Third, we will hear from Carlin Wing, a media scholar, artist, and educator interested in questions of how individual and collective gestures carry, transit, and transmute history. Her current book project, Bounce, A History of Balls, Walls, and Gaming Bodies, follows an array of bouncing balls through the histories of electronic and non-electronic games across the spectrum of play, game, and sport. And she's an assistant professor of media studies at Scripps College. Lastly, we'll hear from Pato, Herbert, an artist, teacher, and organizer. He is also a COVID-19 long hauler, living with the ongoing impacts of the coronavirus since March of 2020 and publicly addressing the pandemic through creativity and community building. His solo exhibition about long COVID, Lingering, was curated by Ruti Talmor and debuted at Pitzer College last year. Herbert also serves as chair and teaches in the Department of Art and Public Policy at the Tisch School of the Arts at NYU. So I'll turn it over to Angelica. We'll hear from the panelists, and then we'll all gather back together. Thanks so much for being here.
Hello, everybody. So I'm very happy to be here. I have been a long supporter and admirer of the Psychosocial Foundation, so it's exciting to be on a panel with them. So I'm going to just offer a few sort of points of reflection and thoughts that emerged. I hadn't revisited The Body Keeps the Score in a surprisingly long time, and rereading it brought up a lot more questions and thoughts than I can possibly sort through in a short little, talk right now and then in our conversations. But I hope that we at least get to think together around some of these things. My research, I'm very interested in my research in how trauma as a concept has sort of emerged in the history of science and technology, how issues of embodiment have faded in and out of interest in the history of trauma, and specifically how trauma as a model actually rests on a model of the human as a kind of information processing machine. Which I think we can see sort of in this book as well, and which we can maybe talk about later. But what I really want to sort of rest with here is the kind of history of trauma and development of trauma that this book gives us, and what sort of questions or histories or things that it elides in the history that it does give us. So a couple of times during the book, van der Kolk tells different versions of sort of him being introduced and getting involved in the study of trauma. And he talks about really two distinct experiences, at least that stood out to me on this reread. One of them was while he was working with veterans of the Vietnam War, and another was while he was working at a hospital in Boston that was caring for a lot of college-aged patients with a wide spectrum of different mental diagnoses, mental illnesses, including depression, anxiety, bipolar, schizophrenia, amongst others. And this latter story, this experience he had very early on in Boston, is really what I want to focus on. The way that he tells the story is that he noticed something, but he didn't yet have a name for what it was. In working with patients at the mental hospital in Boston, van der Kolk starts to notice, he tells us, that many of the patients had histories of childhood abuse or neglect, whether that be physical, emotional, sexual, or a combination of the three. And he began to wonder if perhaps all these different mental illnesses actually had a more fundamental cause that hadn't been examined, what he would later come to understand as trauma. I want to sort of rest with this because this story mirrors many other stories that have been told in the last few decades by trauma researchers who were also working in the last 30 years of the 20th century when trauma kind of reemerged as this object of interest. Anne Burgess, who is a researcher who came up with the diagnosis rape trauma syndrome before PTSD was added to the DSM-3, also a diagnosis that is conveniently sort of written out of this history that van der Kolk gives us and is, I think, only I've seen included in the history that Judith Herman gives us in Trauma and Recovery. But Anne Burgess recently published this book, an autobiographical book in 2021 called A Killer by Design, and she gives almost the exact same kind of story as van der Kolk does with her early experiences in the Spring Grove State Hospital in Maryland. She notices that there is a commonality shared with all of these patients with all of these different mental diagnoses, namely that they all have childhood trauma. Similarly, Robert Anda and Vincent Felitti, who were the co-principal investigators for the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which is cited frequently in van der Kolk's The Body Keeps a Score, but also who worked very closely with van der Kolk later on, they tell the story of their research in a similar way as well. Felitti was working with people struggling with obesity at Kaiser Permanente in California and began to realize that many of his patients had histories of childhood sexual abuse. Anda was working at the CDC studying diseases associated or caused by smoking and found himself wondering if there was an original cause for the resistance of so many to quitting, even knowing the adverse effects on their well-being. In all these researcher stories, trauma is something that is lurking underneath an array of different symptoms and diseases. And there are many more I could list besides just the couple I've just talked through. Trauma is something here that goes unseen, but needed to be made more visible by these people who noticed it beneath the surface before it had a name. These stories that retell the origin of trauma studies through the personal experience of particular researchers seem to do two things. First, they seem to think about trauma as a discovery, not something that is created or made and is historically contingent, as Hannah sort of alluded to in her introduction to the book, but rather something that was lurking there all along, waiting to be made known. And the second thing that you notice in these stories is that trauma is everywhere and therefore urgent. They all conclude their stories by saying they realized that trauma was at the root of so many different things, that the real object that we needed to be focusing on to make progress for the health and well-being of our individuals and communities is trauma. Its pervasiveness really lent itself to the urgency of the problem and the urgency they felt in getting involved in the study of trauma. So I was thinking about what gets elided or forgotten in the story that van der Kolk tells about trauma that insists upon it as a discovery, and what it might limit for us in 2023 and what we can see here. So the history of trauma, as I understand it, as my sort of dissertation and work is often talking about, is an oscillation between universality and specificity. Researchers and research communities like the Society for the Study of Traumatic Stress attempt for a time to crystallize trauma as a singular shared object of study, one with consistent reactions and phenomena. And then on the flip side, they'll swing in the other direction to critique and insist upon its specificity, pointing to how drastically variable people's reactions to trauma can be, and to how specific types of traumatic experiences lend themselves to very specific symptoms and reactions afterwards. Some of this back and forth between trauma as a universal singular object and one that was necessarily variable and specific to the experience of the individual was collapsed when we see neurobiology and neuroscience become more of a strong presence in trauma studies, which we can see as well, I think, in The Body Keeps a Score, as Bessel van der Kolk was a part of sort of insisting upon the importance of neuroscience and neurobiology for how we understand, think about, and approach healing from trauma. Whereas the desire for making trauma a singular object before the neurosciences seemed to come most prominently out of disciplinary needs, namely trying to bring together people who are studying child abuse, sexual violence, experiences during war, and natural disasters, amongst many other kinds of experiences. Trying to bring all these people under one umbrella was really difficult. But when neuroscience took control, this universal definition of trauma seemed to be more based on an accepted fact rather than a strategic disciplinary move. Van der Kolk writes himself in 1987 about how studies in neuroscience and neurobiology were what made him realize that traumatic reactions are consistent across all types of traumatic stimuli. But this collapsing of different experiences that neuroscience supported in trauma, and I would argue continues to support in trauma with books like Bessel van der Kolk's, ignores some really fundamental parts of those early debates in trauma that were, and I think I would say are, or at least should be, at the heart of how we think about trauma today, and at least how we understand the emergence of the concept. And one of these things is the importance of the social. So early diagnoses like rape trauma syndrome seemed to insist that traumatic reactions were not just defined by who the person was or what the experience was, but how that type of traumatic experience was talked about, treated, and judged by the social world. War trauma came with aspects of shame that PTSD didn't seem able to account for, as people like Jonathan Shea and others critiqued when they proposed the idea of moral injury to talk about the effects of being somebody who enacts violence and witnesses horrible violence. Rape was unique because it did not come only with aspects of shame like war, but also disbelief. Often the experience itself was doubted or questioned or dismissed. Those who had experienced natural disasters did not seem to deal as much with either of these problems, for instance, because of how the social world reacted to natural disasters. So this is all to say that in these moments of contestation in this history of trauma and this oscillation that happens in this history, debates around trauma as a social phenomena, not just a medical phenomena, were everywhere. And the social was, in fact, part of the medical. It structured what a traumatic reaction would be, how we should approach healing. And I think we can see, as Hannah alluded to as well in the introduction, which I'm very glad you did, so I don't have to sort of go through that as well. But I think we can see here another moment of contestation for trauma happening again. People are beginning to write and talk about how trauma has become too big for its britches in some way, has come to define and label every kind of harmful or unpleasant experience. And there are those that worry that the term is becoming useless because it encapsulates every kind of harm that we can think of. What we are noticing is that this is a crisis yet again, I think, of the social meaning of trauma, of what possible social meaning it can and should have. And rereading The Body Keeps a Score made me think about how the story of trauma as a stable object that was discovered lurking beneath the surface of our world and our problems elides these debates about the social nature of trauma and can essentialize too much its neuroscientific, neurobiological aspects, especially interestingly enough, and I'd love to chat about this with the whole panel and with everybody, especially as van der Kolk seems to take often the brain as almost a stand-in for the body, which I think is really interesting. But I also wanted to talk about the second thing that van der Kolk's story seems to emphasize, which is the sense of urgency. And I want to sit with that for a second. Part of this urgency is the idea that trauma is everywhere, that trauma lies at the heart of most medical problems that we confront, whether those be mental illnesses or physical diseases like diabetes and heart disease. This leads to the claim, as van der Kolk himself makes in the book, that trauma is actually the most fundamental and urgent public health problem in the United States and requires many more resources and attention than we're already giving it. I see the way that trauma researchers tell their stories of urgency and van der Kolk's idea at the very core of The Body Keeps a Score, that trauma is stored, even if we don't know it, as part of a kind of larger turn or theme in trauma that I've seen in the last 20 years. And I've been trying to sort of identify and name, and the closest I can come is sort of calling it a toxic turn or something like that. But essentially, there is this turn to thinking about trauma as a type of toxin. Trauma is an invisible agent here that lies at the heart of many different reactions. It's something that is difficult to detect, cannot be seen by the naked eye. It accumulates in the brain and the body, sometimes without us even knowing it, and might only have devastating effects years later, as some toxins sort of lurk beneath the surface and then have devastating effects way down the line. And it seems to behave like a toxin might. It creates an excess of hormones and chemicals that normally would be helpful for us and are fundamental to human survival, making them harmful after the fact, after the trauma, because it reaches a particular like threshold value, which is often a term that is used when we talk about toxicity rather than just sort of like diseases in particular. And it complicates the differentiation between subject and object, as often happens in toxicology. Those who are originally the victims of the toxin, this being trauma here, themselves become toxic to others, violent, abusive, or neglectful. So we can see this idea of trauma as a toxin here, but I also want to sort of nestle it within a larger kind of phenomena that we're seeing, because it is elsewhere as well. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which I mentioned earlier, which van der Kolk talks a lot about, uses the dose response curve, a tool from toxicology, to explain how more adverse experiences in childhood can lead to increased risk for physical health problems in adulthood. Trauma doses and accumulates in you as a toxin might. Even more dramatically and obviously, the work on toxic stress at Harvard Center for the Developing Child sees stress and trauma as becoming toxic to the child after it is prolonged and experienced in the absence of protective relationships with adults that could mediate its effects. And I think the recent language of the toxic person or the toxic relationship is borrowing in part from models of how we harm and are harmed by one another that come primarily, at least in my thinking and historical disciplinary thinking, from how trauma was originally talked about and how it continues to be talked about. This is also in the work of Bruce Perry, who he's primarily working on like stress hormones and how they saturate children's brains, and has recently become a much more popularized author because he published a book with Oprah Winfrey. And we can see it in the idea of the germ theory of violence, which has sort of had a resurgence recently, most specifically in James Gilligan's book, Violence, Reflections on a National Epidemic, which was published in 1997, but I've been seeing a sort of resurgence of interest in it recently. So there's something very appealing, I think, about this way of thinking about trauma. It seems to propose a more ecological and environmental model that shows us how different populations are unevenly exposed to trauma in similar ways to how environmental effects of colonialism are discussed by scholars like Vanessa Agert-Jones or Michelle Murphy. Toxins and chemicals and pollution are felt unevenly across different spaces and populations in the same way that trauma is in this model. But one thing that I have become more and more wary about in this articulation or in this turn to toxicity that we've been seeing is the model of resilience that seems to come out of it. And resilience is a term that comes up a few times throughout van der Kolk's book, and I'd love to rest with it a little bit more. He admires and is in awe of the resilience of his patients, the fact that despite extreme adversity, humans can continue to live and thrive and be happy. Here and in van der Kolk's book, resilience is importantly not a trait that's inborn in somebody, nor is it something that you acquire necessarily just by experiencing hardship, but rather it's something that is given to you by your caretakers. Caretakers serve as an external regulation system for us before we have developed our own self-regulation. And by interacting with them and watching them, we learn how to regulate ourselves and cope with stress and trauma. I'm invested in how we should think about resilience, not just because I think it's really interesting, but also because there has been a surge in studies trying to figure out how do we encourage and create resilience in children and in vulnerable communities in the United States in particular. But I am nervous about this model of resilience because I think resilience here, even if it is not inborn, is still a trait of an individual or an ability that an individual has, which in my mind can lend itself to pathologization of individuals or even pathologization of whole communities who do not thrive in the face of adversity. I want to encourage us to move towards an idea of resilience that is instead distributed and more in line with the work of the anthropologist Leith Mullings. In a study of reproduction in Harlem she conducted during the 1990s, Mullings insisted upon a distributed model of resilience. Resilience is not something that just rests in the individual or even in the family, but something that is shared in a community, distributed across those who you share the space with, the programs that are in place for you, the resources that are available to you. These are the things that make it possible to weather a storm or not. And it's more than simply an inborn or even learned ability to cope. Mullings writes that this model of resilience also serves to move attention away from programs that target individual families, that put health and well-being in the hands of individual responsibility, and emphasizes instead the need for community-based social support programs that emphasized increasing the support system of whole communities rather than focusing our attention on individuals. So I like this model of distributed resilience. So I'm going to offer one more critique of it. It might not be defining resilience as a trait, which I do like. It's something that is shared, but it could still be thought of as a trait of communities rather than as a trait of individuals. And I don't want us to slip into, again, the pathologization of certain communities just because they have suffered in the face of adversity. And this is sort of why I have been toying more recently with the idea of resilience as a type of knowledge, rather than an ability or a trait that is given to us, a type of knowledge that we learn and that we share with each other, a type of knowledge on how to cope and heal and move on. So that's sort of the two big things I wanted to sort of rest with coming out of thinking with van der Kolk's own story. And I just wanted to say like one little last thing, sort of an aside apart from that. You know, I've seen recently some criticism of van der Kolk's book because he does focus and sort of open with this story of Vietnam War veterans who are themselves enacting violence on their families, children, and people around them. And I wanted to just sort of emphasize that I think it is important that van der Kolk does not shy away from looking at not just those who have been harmed, but also those who harm others. And this isn't to say that those who enact violence are deserving of more time and attention than their victims, but van der Kolk seems to fundamentally understand something that was part of the very foundation of the traumatic societies in the United States back in the 1980s. They emphasized that trauma is most often and almost always an interpersonal interaction. And so to fully actually understand it, you must understand both sides of the interaction, the motivations behind both those who harm and those who are harmed, especially because those who harm were often harmed themselves. Although I do wish that van der Kolk sort of expanded this to talk about other populations that experience and enact violence in their own communities. For instance, communities that have high incidences of gun violence. I do think that there is something useful in this resting with the duality of doing harm and being harmed and the sort of circularity of that. So I'm going to sort of stop there with just some thoughts. There's many more things I want to talk about, but I'm eager to hear from the other people here and to hear from all of you. So I will stop there and pass it off to the next. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be on this panel as a practitioner who has not spent a comparable amount of time in formal scholarship, but I'm excited to contribute what I can and look forward to learning from the rest of the panel and from this conversation with you all. So, I'm approaching this roundtable not just as a longtime practitioner of somatics, but I've also been a popular political educator for much longer and done a lot of conflict work and relationship processing amongst left organizers and cultural workers over the years, with mixed results. My peers and I might prefer to distinguish ourselves as politicized somatics practitioners, even though what it means to be politicized varies widely on the left. All this informs my evaluation of the significance of a book that has been no less than an airport book stall bestseller for several years. Much of somatics and trauma work tends to affirm the statement with little doubt. Hell yes, the body keeps the score. But the question for me today is, does the math add up to radical transformation? The field of politicized somatics is still, yes, very experimental and highly contradictory, as Angelica described so well. And I'd like to explore and share my sense of this with you. So we know our current historical moment contains multiple crises: a pandemic, climate crisis, opioid crisis, rise of authoritarianism. These are not only objectively true phenomena, but also stark in the glare of a good segment of the collective psyche, however we think or feel or act in relationship to them. Even the Davos elites assess this as a moment of polycrisis, entitling their recent World Economic Forum "Cooperation in a Fragile World." This poses a conjunctural pressure. Our shared subjectivity and collective will might matter to intervene in the outcome of this confluence and collision of competing social forces. And so our shared subjectivity matters for the outcome of our times. With that, I'm entering this conversation with the feeling that on the one hand, it's kind of a remarkable thing that the language and discourse around trauma and the body has grown so popular, even with what Hannah and Angelica presented in the last decade, and that mass affect is at play and acknowledged in some of the most rationality espousing segments of global societies. After all, our proximity to nature, to even being nature, or our most vulnerable embodiments as part of nature itself have been revealed. We have been naturalized by climate and pandemic in some ways. Many of us might be increasingly inflamed by growing toxicity saturating our environments, as laid out in the recent book by Rupa Maurya and Raj Patel. Long-held masculinist and Eurocentric binaries between self-concept and body might be intuitively somehow withering away on a material objective level, since we are all bodies now, and also as the libidinal economy has been taken over with a whole new scope of attention on the body as an emotional site. So it's pretty wild, and it is certainly more than I expected when I first began to train in somatics. And I think that this could pose an opening of some kind. On the other hand, as a leftist, I have ambivalence along the lines of whether all this popularity and attention might challenge or continue to bolster the kind of cruel optimism that Lauren Berlant speaks of. We might each fantasize about an individualized healing quaffed from the vanity of neoliberal promises that may never quite arrive, as long as racial capitalism and patriarchy keep working us while renting us favors. So always prioritizing that fantasy rather than seeing it in concert and contradiction with material political work might disrupt rather than build that shared collective praxis. And meanwhile, it is the latter, I feel, that amasses us qualitatively and quantitatively as a collective body, if you will, towards reorganizing the systems that oppress us, divide us, and maybe cause us so much of that damn trauma and reactivity in the first place. Maybe. So can we heal our bodies and build the kind of power we need simultaneously, or are we doomed to compromise our attention, making us apologists for one side or the other, locking ourselves in deference epistemologies rather than constructive solidarities, as Olufemi Taiwo says? And yet what or who gets prioritized or left out or erased? What and who or what parts of us get worlded or earthed, as Ranjana Khanna lays out in as so well. This is where I want politicized somatics maybe to come in a little bit. I've distilled 4 guiding principles that a politicized somatics practitioner might take for granted. And the somatic aspects may not have as much issue with the body keeps the score, but their political kernels might. So something to offer in that sense. Number one, the body is the self. Yes. So there is that sort of like a taken for granted understanding that, yes, the body is the self. Second, the self is relational. The third is we are shaped. And the fourth is we shape back. So number one, the body is the self. There is no self without the body. I mean, it's how maybe we talk about it or we practice around it. We are a conscious and unconscious mix of thoughts, emotions, and sensations. The brain runs through the body via the nervous system. The sort of infamous Cartesian dialectic or mind-body split does not seem to hold. And we are animals who keep trying to integrate our complicated cognitive apparatus. Number two, the self is relational. The individual self is already an embodiment of relationship. We are interdependent with others. We are porous with our environment. We are part of collective bodies, whether groups or communities or societies, in which we can also activate or regulate one another's affect. Lots to say here. I don't know, think dance parties, pandemics, uprisings, cultural affect, maybe a nation state. We need a little theorizing there. Number three is we are shaped. We are shaped somatically by separate and intersecting sites, family, community, institutions, social forces, environment, into automatic reactions, protective habits and adaptations in our bodies, and also worldviews under a range of real and perceived pressures. And then finally, we shape back. And this is the sort of the politicized aspect of politicized somatics. So we shape back just from living and impacting one another, but we can also intentionally shape back by cultivating critical agency to reshape ourselves, each other, and other sites that shaped us in the first place. We can practice to find our centers, what we care about or live for, to be present and open and connected to ourselves and to others. We can practice self-awareness and an acceptance of our shaping, that threats might be old triggers to soften, and that discomfort is not necessarily danger, so we regenerate new forms of safety with others. We might practice to regulate our nervous systems and those of others, allow for our feelings, cultivate more granular emotions and proportionate responses out of mutual dignity. And we are not necessarily condemned to nor paralyzed by trauma, and there may be non-paralyzing traumas, as Adam Phillips might say. So we might live in a traumatized society writ large, but there are individual gradations anyway in how we process hardship and pain. Our collective subjectivities might have to learn and account for that, as each according to their ability, to each according to their need, different from individualistic care. And we can cultivate practices from shared values and commitments to form those constructive solidarities as a collective body. So those are some of those main guiding principles, but I want to emphasize a few important polarities that we keep grappling with in politicized somatics. And I constantly traverse the spectrum within these myself, and maybe there's more discussion to have about them. So one is matter, including materialism, and then mystery. So Marilyn Robinson recently had, the novelist had just published this piece in the New York Review of Books on the tension between religion and science and the mutual caricatures that have plagued this relationship. And she marvels at quantum entanglement. And I know a lot of somatics practitioners intuitively engage in a kind of spiritual physics of movement through the body. We know well the pastoral support that a community healer can offer, and the non-antagonistic contradictions offered by liberation theology, for example. So nevertheless, the polarity persists and shapes practitioners' habits towards one or another tendency. And relatedly, there's historically a polarity in therapeutic support between, yes, this biochemistry and neurobiology on the one hand, and then the psychodynamic relationship on the other, with its talking and relationality and subjective meaning making. And in somatics, we attempt to cultivate agency in our neurobiology through practice. So this actively sits in this tension. Related to that, on the left, we talk about the polarities of objective and subjective conditions. We want to cultivate shared subjective purpose and will, but perceptions differ, and constructing shared realities is a challenge in our time. Not to mention our own threat response. Our own threat responses can be based on perception belonging to old stories within rather than a current shared reality. Another polarity is sort of that individual versus collective, or like that's another one. And within that, a more emancipatory neoliberal individualism with the kind of vanities and narcissisms that are hard to track versus individual healing with a critical agency towards collective solidarity. Related are assessments that align with a body-based and identity-based essentialism on the one hand, and then on the other hand, a more non-essentialist curiosity about the particularities of characteristics and traits in an individual who might hold social shaping in their form. In that is also the very complex task of being able to distinguish which bodies are most on the line as distinct from who is most traumatized. Are the most traumatized necessarily always the most objectively oppressed, to put it crudely? And again, people process even immense hardship in specific variegated ways. Maybe there's a call here to be aware of sentimentality, coddling, cultiness, transference, deference. That's all very present in left and movement building somatics culture. Practitioners hold these tensions consciously and unconsciously in a typical somatics process or container called the arc of transformation. As witness and collaborator, they move an individual or collective body through an awareness of their shaping while cultivating a more longed for shape. This is done through a combination of talk, symbologies, physical practice, and body work. It's both linear in that there's an articulated intentional shape, and cyclical in that it's poetic and archetypal, and there's no obvious there except the pitch for radical acceptance of the body and self in relationship. So the call always is to invite the body into more opening imagination and possibility, both material and mysterious, until maybe that score starts to add up somehow. That's all I'll say for now.
Thank you so much. And now we'll hear from Carlin.
Thank you both. It's really rich to think with. And can you hear me okay? Okay. So I'm gonna show a few images in a moment, but I did want to start by saying that I do my thinking and wondering about gestures and bodies and ways of being while I'm walking around Los Angeles, and very much with many friends, colleagues, students, practitioners, as well as many living and no longer living artists and writers and thinkers. And I wanted to name a special thank you today to Hannah for the invitation and the opportunity, to the other panelists, to my colleague Ruchi Talmor, who I've been thinking and teaching about bodies as and in media with for the past year, to the practitioners, the body practitioners, Steve Gombrich, Katrina Umber, and Casey Lockwood for their practices, and to Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams and the participants in the No Big Deal Sit for the gift of daily practice and collective process. They're very much kind of here collectively supporting the thinking and the ideas I'm going to share today. And it occurred to me to do that in part because one thing that struck me rereading The Body Keeps the Score was the ways I felt poorly accompanied by Bessel van der Kolk as an author. And so it made me begin thinking about accompaniment. And it's not something I had a lot of time in the end to get into, but I'll voice that now. So now I'm gonna give us some things to look at. There we go. All right, so the image on the slide is a graphic score by the artist Corey Fogel. Fogel is actually an artist, a musician, and a friend here in Los Angeles who's been developing forms of non-traditional notation for musical improvisation. As opposed to more linear or programmatic scores, which he describes as being more instructive, this score and the two others of his that I'll share today are more transcriptive, descriptive, and impressionistic. This is his language. They lack the obvious instructivity of actively reading a traditional right to left score. So the one you're looking at now, which is painted on a very, very large wall in the nonprofit art space in LA, Human Resources, moves both left to right and right to left simultaneously. And it's left to the musicians to kind of manage that kind of two directionality. This one is more of an environment, describing an overall dynamic of interactivity for musicians to interpret outside of any particularly imagined time frame. So as I was thinking over the past month about different available understandings of bodies and scores, and all that the turn of phrase or slogan, as Hannah said, the body keeps the score, gathers under its umbrella, I was also remembering visiting Fogel as he installed the works at Human Resources in January of 2021. It was my first time in an art space since March 2020, and was at the same time that I was reading The Body Keeps the Score for the first time. So with his permission, I'm sharing the documentation of these scores more as an accompaniment or counterpoint or parallel track to my thoughts about this text, with the hopes that they will support an opening of some space around our understandings of what scores can be, right? They can be marks or incisions or wounds. They can be accumulations, like Angelica's reference of the adverse event score. It can be the score, the real facts of the present situation. Gains, particularly illicit gains, musical notation and frameworks for improvisation. So I've now read The Body Keeps the Score twice. These two readings were differently disturbed and disturbing. So maybe here I'm picking up a little bit on Sumitra's idea of discomfort, and discomfort not always being bad. By this, I mean they were somatically activating in a manner that maps onto or seems to parallel in certain ways van der Kolk's own definition of trauma. So van der Kolk first used the phrase to title a paper in '94 to communicate the idea that a trauma is stored in somatic memory and expressed as changes in the biological stress response. And then 20 years later, in the book that we're discussing today, he puts it another way. Trauma is much more than a story about something that happened long ago. The emotions and physical sensations that were imprinted during the trauma are experienced not as memories, but as disruptive physical reactions to the present. The first time I read this book, I was not reading critically. I was reading from a place of desperation, reaching out for any and all practices, healing modalities, books, talks, groups, collectives that might help me understand the ways in which I no longer recognized myself, my ways of moving, thinking, or feeling, in the wake of a sequence of experiences that involved a great deal of loss, a sense of threat, and left me reeling with pain and shame and grief and fear. I imagine this reading from desperation may be familiar to some, if not many, of the readers of this book, and suspect that the commonness of desperation in our contemporary moment, maybe if for many different reasons, maybe one reason the book has lived on the bestseller list almost continuously since its publication. Unlike many of the therapeutic modalities described in the book itself, housed in that remarkably named genre, self-help, which of course erases all the relationality, both of like the work of the book and then how it lives in the world, can be purchased at the relatively low cost of $14 or found as a free PDF on Reddit threads or received from a friend who's passing it along. My memory of that first reading is of wave upon wave of activation, recognition, and confusion about the relationship between these. Alongside the activation was a sense of validation, affirmation, confirmation, confirmation from authority, right? So there's a huge role that authority, that van der Kolk as an authority plays in this book. That ideas that I'd already begun to learn about through other routes were kind of validated as good ways. So he names a lot of things that I still, that are important to me, and I think are of real value as practices, from play to movement, to breath, to rhythm, to theater, to yoga, to somatic experiencing. He emphasizes collective and community, polyvagal theory, body practices to regulate nervous systems, talk therapy, EMDR. It would take a while to actually name the whole list. At the same time, I had a sense that the book itself was in some way enacting a traumatic experience, even as it was offering names for something that I had been experiencing prior to reading. In that moment in 2021, I wasn't able to do more than name a confusion around what was me and mine and what belonged to the book. So when I began rereading the book for the purposes of this panel, it was from a more settled place and with critical intention. And so I was surprised when re-encountering the text immediately jolted me into panic and overwhelm. As I picked it up and put it down over the last month, I noted the sensations, right? Well trained now with all that, like grasping for all the things. Some racing sense of contraction in my chest, the back of my throat, sandpaper clogged head, not quite an itch, not an itch, some muddy pain. These sensations would begin almost immediately starting when I started to read and would stay with me long after I'd put the book down. As the days passed, I began to wonder at the good student in me turned responsible scholar, maybe, who seemed so set on completing this assignment. And then a week into reading, I finally broke through the panic to the layers of grief and rage that it had been masking. And after I spent a little time with how it was making me want to scream and break things and cry, and with the ways it was connecting me to parts of myself that have both been harmed and to the parts of myself that are capable of harming others, I began to cobble together some questions about disturbed reading. It's a disturbing book, which I think has been spoken to already. It is most plainly disturbing because the violence, abuse, pain, and suffering described in detail are both extreme and extremely common. Just to confront and sit with the stories of individual suffering that he shares is and should be disturbing. Another way in which the book disturbs, and I think this has been referenced by the other speakers, is through the story of institutional and pharmaceutical responses to this vast amount of suffering. Van der Kolk describes his work in the field, including establishing therapies and medications that have gone on to become dominant, even though by the time he's writing, he has long since determined they're not particularly effective. Confronting the combination of the lack of access to treatment together with the scale of mistreatment is enraging. At root, then, there is the confrontation with the way this book simultaneously describes and reveals itself to be a product of a deeply ill society. A society so deeply disturbed by histories of racial capitalism, imperialism, and white supremacy that it shows up at the scale of syntax and at the scale of vast and heartbreaking amounts of violence, abuse, and suffering. So this is the score in one sense, in the sense of the real facts of the present situation. And it's echoing especially loudly with me today in the wake of yesterday's release of the body cam video of Tyre Nichols' beating. In the same week that Nichols was beaten, the beginning of 2023, 3 men were killed here in Los Angeles by police: Oscar Leon Sanchez, Takar Smith, and Keenan Anderson, who was the cousin of BLM founder Patrisse Cullors. Tyre Nichols' mother, Rovan Wells, who many of you may have heard in the past few days, and stepfather Rodney Wells have asked news media to share the video, while also making it clear that the video is not necessary to know what happened to their son. The circulation of the hospital photo and now the video evoke a history of asking this country to confront, to be disturbed by, its ongoing practice of sanctioned state violence, from Emmett Till to Rodney King to George Floyd, and now to Tyre Nichols. So this is to return to the question of being disturbed. Being willing to be disturbed is necessary at times, and differently necessary for different people. Resbo Menachem, whose book My Grandmother's Hands addresses racialized trauma directly, argues for a kind of somatic abolitionism. And he talks about it as kind of like the importance of doing reps. And I have some questions. I was thinking about it, Angelica, with your discussion of resilience. I have questions about that approach and the ways it kind of puts the coping onto the individual. But he's arguing for doing body practices that will build up a tolerance for being disturbed by racialized trauma, because reacting from the given societal scripts, so not having that tolerance and reacting from the given societal scripts, from the given instructive scores, causes harm and gets Black and brown people killed. I'm thinking alongside and between Menachem on the one hand and Bayo Akomolafe on the other, who reminds us that we are context-made bodies and calls trauma the ideological manufacturing of the body, meaning the body as lived by the liberal subject. Kind of as made, like it is how we are made into these lived bodied lives. So that's the question I'm offering today to the panel. It's a question about disturbance and the ongoing improvisational work of discerning how and when to be in relationship to somatic experiences of disturbance and to a disturbed and disturbing world. What constitutes necessary versus unnecessary suffering? And what are the ways to feel settled and secure enough in our own belonging, to use a phrase of Rev. Angels, so that we can interrupt the cultural scripts, the scores that have been handed to us, and turn to the pursuit of individual and collective liberation. With that, I will pass it along.
Awesome.
I'm Pato. It's really such an honor to be here, and I want to thank Hannah and Carlin for this opportunity and this beautiful gathering. I'm going to do an illustrated performative reading The title is Scorekeeping Over the Long Haul. Whenever I go to a clinic, they give me a disposable surgical mask. I've been saving them since becoming ill in March 2020. This is a selfie I took in early April 2020 when I went to urgent care because I was having trouble breathing. I've had these masks electroplated in nickel, an unprecious metal that looks silverish. This one is from my pulmonary function lab test on March 12th, 2021. I now have over 30 of these masks from my COVID visits. The series is called No Silver Linings, Long Hauling, and is presented on 3 gallery walls as a timeline of my interfacing with the medical establishment. Here we have some from December 2021, my pre-op surgery and SIBO breath test masks. This is a picture of me last April, facing the masks and weeping in the back room of my solo exhibition titled Lingering, which was carefully and lovingly curated by Ruti Talmor and shown at Pitzer College. We're looking at a piece called Better, but Not Well. It's made of charred, salvaged California live oak and salvaged melted auto parts. I'm going to read from a social media post from January 21st, 2022, so just over a year ago. Way back in my second month of being sick, Better but Not Well became my standard reply to people's loving, concerned, and sometimes incredulous questions about how I'm feeling. I do notice shifts and subtle improvements every 3 months or so, and that's been true over these first 2 years, now 3, of being sick. Everybody's response to this coronavirus is unique, and my symptoms continue to shift and evolve. I still deal with headaches, insomnia, brain fog, GI pain, overstimulation, struggles with organization, motivation, and focus, and the many emotional and spiritual challenges that come with chronic illness. I can make my offerings of thanks for being here, and I do, daily, at least as often as I cry, which I do all the time now, thanks to COVID leaving me with a condition called pseudobulbar effect. My neurologist explained the condition to me, the diagnosis for all my puddles. She said some people laugh, like the Joker in the Batman movies, and others cry, like La Llorona, I think, like me. I suppose this COVID symptom is also a syndrome, but I think of the tears as libations, and for me, they come most often in moments of wonder, appreciation, and joy. Pacing and care help greatly, as do mutual aid and community. Here we're looking at another piece from the exhibition. This one is called Mutual Aid, and it's carved from a salvaged eucalyptus limb that had fallen in a 2020 storm. Vaccines and boosters are vital. They're only part of the ongoing changes we need. Access to quality-free healthcare, medicine, testing and prevention tools, mental health support, and somatic healing. I should have known Sumitra. Paid sick leave, flexible work schedules and adjusted workflows, safe housing, nutritious food, clean water, vitamins and anti-inflammatory supplements, harm reduction, updated policy and legal frameworks. These can all make the difference between life and death. So can countering social isolation and ensuring vibrant, safe interconnectedness with one another. This piece is called Hold Me. The work gives a sense of something transformed. I am something and someone transformed. Together, we here at this gathering are a beautiful network of intersecting and fantabulous relations, transforming one another and our shared world. And this piece is called Spoonies, and in case it's not obvious, this body of work, the Countermeasure series, is drawing on Kristen Miserandino's spoon theory and what many of us living with chronic illness and disability call our spoons, or how much energy we do or don't have in a given day or moment, and how we make community together and call ourselves spoonies. You know, Angelica reminded us of resilience as knowledge, and Sumitra's reminder about politicizing and shaping back. Carlin about accompanying and counterpoint and disturbance and what it means that the body is not simply singular. The body that keeps score is never singular, impermeable, or intact. It is never only ours. Viruses and droplets keep score too. Fiona Lowenstein was one of the first publicly outspoken people living with long COVID in the US and advocating and organizing around our needs. Here the two of us are clowning and having fun in LA's Elysian Park after having finally met in 2022. They conceptualized and edited the groundbreaking long COVID survival guide, and their work reminds us that the body is ever interconnected and collective. Fiona and Carla Monterroso did a fabulous segment on NPR late last year. Carla's chapter, It Wasn't the Beans and Rice, Fighting Biased Healthcare Systems with Community Care, signals that despite immense structural inequity, some collective bodies can be ever caring and life-sustaining. And I share these with permission. She reminds us, quote, "We do nothing to recognize the value in those who perform low-wage work. Even the language that we use to describe this work, quote unquote unskilled, underplays the tremendous level of skill being performed every day by people in professions the economy constantly devalues, people doing farm work, child and elderly care work, and food service work are skilled yet unprotected workers. For a brief moment, we called these people essential workers, and then quickly made decision after decision that put them in precarious positions where they had to choose whether to expose themselves and their families to this virus or lose their jobs. It's hard to describe what that precarity does to you, especially when you grew up in a working class household and are the first in your family to know the stability of salaried work. People of color are constantly making trade-offs, deciding whether to prioritize their financial stability over their health and well-being. When this pandemic hit, we were made to feel like we were heroes for making that trade-off, as long as we kept making it. And then Carla closes her essay by saying, I am forever altered by my illness experience. For all of the terrible things COVID did, it's with this definition of love in mind that I tell you that it taught me how to love and be loved. I was loved by my community in the truest sense. While it's heartbreaking to know we aren't loved in this way by our own country, I've watched with pride as we've used our collective power to ensure our mutual survival in a time of obscene trauma and illness. It's this love that has me sitting here, reflecting on these stories in service to what I hope is your acknowledgement, catharsis, care, and eventual healing. There's a version of me that could not have allowed herself to be helped in the way I've been helped because of the relationship to productivity and work that I held not very long ago. But we cannot do this alone. We need one another. So whatever way it happens for you with the people around you or people online, find your people. I'm clearer now than I've ever been. We're all we've got. And here are, Carla and Fiona and me having a safe outdoor potluck picnic earlier this month. Finally got to meet in person, mutual aid, balcony style in LA over the holidays. Brandy Catherine Herrera, whose body is its own powerful, if vulnerable score, and who posts most days that she is able to take her brief but slowly deepening walks and essential wall stretches, reminding us of the possibility and urgency of our care practices. In 2022, and this is with permission, Brandy released her spectacular, sharp, and poignant book, Mother is a Body. Brandy and I only know each other through online community and care, but she generously gifted me a copy and with it this beautiful inscription. Pato, this book, which was edited and finalized while I was first beginning to struggle with long COVID, is for all of the artists and creators who continue to inspire and propel me forward, just like you. Poco a poco, as you say, a new mantra for me too, and some suitable vernacular. The last section of her book is titled By the Mystery of Those That Swim. That piece closes, and so we have proof of ourselves. Out of the past spring all living creatures full of confusion. It's easy to get bummed out, you know, but what's the big deal? We're fonts of great knowledge, even as our bodies are a disease. We get here all the same, and then we're gone. A copy of us lies deep inside of most swans, which is comforting at night. And as we're in the midst of still more winter calamity and inequitable scorekeeping, I'll close with a few last pieces from the Countermeasures series. On the right is a charred eucalyptus piece called Surge. On the left, what too many COVID compañeras and I have been experiencing these last few weeks, come months, come years, flare up, both made of charred eucalyptus. And I'll conclude with a reminder to myself of the score that this body I'm in will play whenever I'm flaring or crashing or burning or tearing up and out. Pacing. Pacing. Gracias.
Thank you so much. And to everyone for joining. We're now going to bring back all of the panelists. And these 4 talks have been so moving and vulnerable and recontextualizing this book for me, and I imagine for everyone differently in the audience. I had questions and notes for everyone, but Carlin posed a question to the panel, and I wonder if we might start there. Carlin said the question that she was offering today is a question about disturbance and the ongoing improvisational work of discerning how and when to be in relationship to somatic experiences of disturbance and to a disturbed and disturbing world. And this question, I think Carlin intuited, runs through all 4 of the performances, presentations, genealogies, oscillations, ambivalences about the idea of the body keeping the score in Van der Kolk's hands, right? Which is also to locate him there. You know, Carlin opened by saying accompanied and unaccompanied. So I just want to turn that out to the panel as a way to have the 4 of you speak to each other. And then, of course, to the audience, as you have questions and want to put them in the chat or raise your hand, as always, please feel free and I will moderate. Thank you so, so much.
I want to sort of on the question of like disturbance. I think it's a sort of preliminary thought, I guess, but there's many different ways that trauma gets talked about, and I this language of disturbance I think gets mimicked in similar language to like what trauma is. Like trauma is a disturbance. It is an interruption of something. It is an interruption of continuities, and in the same way, I think like pointing to the way that we sit with, well, I suppose like hearing stories of disturbance are themselves disturbing. Hearing stories of interruption can themselves be interrupting. And yeah, I wanted to sort of, I guess, second something that Carlin had said about rereading this book this time, which I similarly sort of had a much more somatic reaction to reading it this time than maybe I've had in the past. I'm not sure if it was because I was attuned to the ways that these stories were being told, or something else, but there was a way in reading this book that I felt this sort of like mirroring effect of reading a disturbance, reading in an interruption, reading about interruption, feeling myself disturbed and interrupted, which of course made me think a lot about what does it mean to be somebody who not only experiences trauma, but works with trauma like Van der Kolk, and I think reflects sort of the process that I'm sure all of us have. Yes, which is his theory. It's very mimetic, exactly. Anyway, so it's just sort of a collection of thoughts, but I was thinking a lot about how there's a trio maybe here of disturbance and interruption. The reader, the person whose experience we are reading, but then also the person who verbalized or wrote down or articulated that experience for us. And it's, I don't know, that's sort of the initial thing that came to mind in terms of sort of interacting with this book after a couple of years of having not read it before. So yeah, I think that's a beautiful question, Carlin. Thank you for that.
I can just, I appreciate that triangle. And I think what it just makes me want to say out loud is that when I was doing this reading this time, it really feeling like some sense of what he was and wasn't in control of, like what, kind of what was there because he wanted it to be there. And then what was coming from having trauma be something he was so enmeshed in, that it was, and how that was showing up on the page. Like when he describes in some instances being very careful with patients, like kind of being very aware of not making eye contact right away, or kind of like how much space to leave in the room, and then thinking like what's the equivalent of when we're if someone's writing and imagining a reader. So Menachem's book, for example, gives a set of body practices as it goes along. Those also can be quite challenging and quite activating, but it's kind of a very different address to the reader in the context of the disturbingness of it all.
I'm not sure exactly what I want to say here, but with disturbance, I'm kind of stuck on sort of almost the power of suggestion of it and its shaping quality too, and like what it means to how it ends up shaping relationship, and then the relationships in the kind of cultures we find ourselves in. So if it becomes this the sort of the power of suggestion of trauma itself, and then how we actually then relate to trauma and relate to one another via the language of trauma, and what that does to then what it means to relate forward and then talk about healing and engage in that respect, and how that becomes our new kind of perhaps binary way of thinking about it, and sort of treating trauma and the disturbance of trauma and that interruption in continuity as like the sort of point of departure and the foregone conclusion, and so here we are, and then that necessitates then talking about things in this way. So I mean that's what it sort of brings up for me, and then and then I think about our the kind of culture of politicized somatics, or just somatics on in left movement building spaces, and how much we can, yes, then we start to sort of draw from each other this way of behaving, and then the language, and so what do we do with that when we kind of go deeper into then taking for granted and essentializing exactly what we are, what we experience as this falls under just the trauma rubric, and then this is how we and that it becomes about, and also then harm and repair, like what that does in left spaces when we're focused on the interpersonal so much, and then when privileged discourses get involved, and there's so much that we're seeing right now where it gets really just there's a lot of undoing without a lot of ways to figure out how to I think almost like shore up all the language with new principles, with almost like a way of being principled about how to approach one another. So I'm my head is very stuck in that kind of thing right now, but there is something here around like how do we hold one another, and also be principled about holding one another as this new language and Geist shapes us. So
I want to give Pato a chance to respond to that question as well. But just what you just said just sort of made me think of something, Sumitra, that I just wanted to sort of like throw out there, which is this language of disturbance, interruption, and like, as you were saying, like, how do we recovery and this harm and recovery, this sort of language, and like, what does recovery actually look like, and what does this model sort of, invite for what recovery should look like? And one thing that just came to mind as you were speaking was the way that this language, and as we saw in Van der Kolk's book as well, we can see very clearly that like the problem of trauma is supposed to be resolved by integration, by sort of making something that was an interruption or a disruption or a disturbance in the system that is the human, or in the life narrative that is an individual. We're supposed to sort of integrate that experience. That's sort of the fundamental, I think one of the fundamental claims that Van der Kolk makes in different ways throughout the book is like, healing is integrating that experience, is making an interruption or a disruption no longer an interruption or disruption, which I understand the sort of science behind that and the desire for that, but want to sort of maybe resist that, at least in some ways, just because if trauma is a disruption and an interruption, do we want to sort of insist upon it no longer being that thing? What if you feel as if that trauma was a disruption or interruption? What if you do not want that trauma to be integrated into your life history or life narrative? What if you feel like you can't? Does that mean it is impossible for you to recover? I feel like that wouldn't be what we would want to claim. So I just wanted to sort of throw that out there. As you were speaking, I started thinking about that.
Carlin, I apologize. Could you repeat the question? That was the prompt for this section of the discussion.
Sure. Let me find it. And actually, well, it's a question about disturbance and the ongoing improvisational work of discerning how and when to be in relationship to somatic experiences of disturbance and to a disturbed and disturbing world. And I'll tack on that Sumitra question, like naming principles, made me think immediately about the talk you just shared, and everything that was embedded in, from the picture of you goofing off to everything you shared about mutuality and naming experience. And so that felt like I was going to ask you about kind of
about goofing off.
About goofing off as a principle.
Yeah, I'd like to introduce laughter into our discussion of somatics and trauma and disturbance, and especially since some people with pseudobulbar laugh like the Joker character, right? And it's really social norms that deem it inappropriate or uncontrolled. But I feel there's a danger, I think, in romanticizing, for instance, resilience, but the way deficit is assumed and constantly reimposed violently on so many of us, that resilience can be just a counterfoil. It's almost like a kind of jujitsu that redirects, even though resilience can be its own trap if it avoids the structural inequity that causes us to need to be resilient in the first place. But having said that kind of quagmire, which is an echo maybe of your triangle, Angelica, like I feel really insistent on the vibrancy and vitality that can still be possible, which is different than saying like, person up, it's going to be okay, positive attitude, right? It's not nearly that simple. But when we do it together in and through our traumas, despite our traumas, there's something really powerful, the holding that I think you were reminding us of, Sumitra. And I think, a couple of practices that have been really important, in addition to pacing in relationship to energy and really questioning demands on productivity or worth through an ableist and abled body, are douling, which the HIV collective I work with, What Would an HIV Doula Do, understands that doulas hold space with and for people in times of transition. And that's not simply unidirectional, a la our question about the reader or the author, which a book as a form and a practice kind of assumes, but rather it could be relational, and at different moments we doula one another collectively while recognizing what are the needs of the moment that maybe need to take precedent and maybe need to be triaged beyond a duo or even a community unit, but out to the structural. And then in a more immediate sense, like harm reduction, like how do we identify what might continue to do harm, not just in substance use or in sex practices, but in the way we conduct ourselves, which I have a sense Sumitra, like your work is constantly having you holding, in some ways dueling and harm reducing as build movements, in the face of what we've done. So, the goofing off and the picnic are reminders that or just the art itself, like there's all kinds of ways to have vibrancy despite, and yet we can't just kind of craft workshop our way out of the structural violence that we're facing. So I guess I say that by way of just the holding one another and my concern about disturbance as a frame. I quite like it for naming that there's something really painful, destructive even maybe, but it does assume a kind of baseline, right, of norm. And, if I think of the pandemic as a kind of disturbance, well, yeah, it's a big old disturbance. And the notion that we can go back, for instance, that sometimes healing, recuperation, recovery, there's a temporal thing that has to be reckoned with politically. I don't particularly want to go back to, first arrival of the soldiers on these shores, or, enslavement, or we can't go back to a time pre, smallpox decimation, pre-HIV. We are in these moments now. And so we have to hold them, if not only be subject to them. And so I'm kind of most excited, hence the play and my ramble here, but about the disruptions we make back to disruption, as it were. It's like disruption squared or cubed. And I love that it was really quick, Sumitra, but you had dance floor in there, and I just love that moment was there, right? I'll pause.
And maybe I'll just keep inviting questions. And of course, the panelists, if you want to come back to each other through any of them or return, that's totally invited. But MKM, you have your hand up if you want to voice your question.
I'll certainly try. Thank you, everybody, for your presentation. There's already so much to think about in reading the book alone, and now I feel like I have like 4 other kind of like shadow sectors to like that now I'm thinking about more. And I'm trying to kind of think about a little bit from each of you, and like looking at some of the questions in the chat. I feel like this is sort of a relevant question, and kind of what you're talking about is like, it sounds like in the book and based on what you're talking about, and I'm also a mental health practitioner, that the solution, or not a solution, but something to be helpful in dealing with traumatized person, trauma in general, is community and relationality. And you guys brought in the social, and how the social can like negatively or positively impact. And somebody in the chat also brought this up, but I guess I really appreciate the framing of trauma as like toxic or a toxin, and not only to the person holding it, but like I'm just thinking about how that phrase, like, oh, that person is toxic, like I'm gonna like get away from that, like we avoid toxic, that we try to get away from it. I appreciate you bringing that in, Angelica, as far as just like, what about people who don't want to integrate it? I mean, that is what like splitting, repression, etc. are. It's just like I am dissociating the image from the feeling, because it is too much altogether. And how that, I'm just thinking about the paradox and the dilemma of the fact that like I do believe that like community and like relationality and like support are some of the best like free like devices that can exist to help like process or integrate or just like look more closely at trauma, while there's also the fact that a lot of people don't really want to be near it. It's like we kind of sequester it to like mental health community, or like that's been an interesting thing. I think I've heard over the past few years of like, there need to be more mental health, more qualified people, abolish these things and bring in more of this. And I guess I was also just thinking about spiritual communities like 12-step, or like other sort of like non-radical like religious communities, where I feel like there is something about like a group that kind of has a higher power or something that seems more successful at sort of like walking toward trauma in a way. So I guess I'm just thinking about that dilemma, and how it feels sometimes like very paradoxical, where it's like if one could just be sort of like seen and like felt and like held in their kind of experience, there might be, it might not feel so toxic, but that a lot of people don't really want to touch it. So I don't know, that's like me trying to speak to almost everything that's been said, and also some of what some people said in the chat as well, of like where trauma isn't invisible, and there is the kind of desire to be like, no, I will not, I don't want to get close to that. I don't want to be infected by that thing or something. I don't really have a question, I suppose, except that how does what gets in the what makes some sectors more successful at walking towards that than like kind of distancing, I suppose.
You mentioned kind of groups with higher power, which is, I assume in part, at least includes 12-step programs. And at least in my experience, that has, like, one of the things like tight frameworks do is like, it allows people to leave a lot at the door. And that's what helps make a collective space. It's hard to make a collective space. And I'd love to hear, Sumitra, you were referencing that throughout your talk, right? Both like doing the work of that and the ups and downs of doing the work of that. So I think like at least in that example of 12-step, people leave a lot at the door. And of course, and there's all these rules about, like you don't give your profession, and you don't, there's just a lot people don't have to know about you for you to be able to be there and be together and recognize something in common, and recognize that these things are relational. But the downside, or I would say kind of like one of the problems with that is a lot of what's been named today about the role of the larger kind of social structures and systemic injustice and all of that also gets like theoretically left at the door, but of course it's also still in the room. So that's, I think, kind of any site will have its contradictions. And so I think at least that was one thing that I heard in what you said, or one response.
I mean, I definitely think as well that this is about holding the contradictions more than anything else in these spaces. And we're constantly navigating in various sort of somatic spaces, what it means to just be, we're messy beings, that we are, there's not a there, and there is no pre-disturbance state necessarily. And there is a kind of inclusivity to when you walk in the door, whatever sort of your specific identity or shaping, that there's some, like, you're walking in through the door because there's you want to relate around that, and so then it's about navigating that. And then I think it just is always contradictory, but that's part of the ground, I think, of being there with one another. And I think the biggest thing is yes, connectivity, and staying in relationship, as opposed to discarding or like when there is whatever the reactivity is, whatever the sort of disturbing thing is, right? It's what does it mean to kind of just reset, and not in some sort of like sanitizing way, but but reset just relationally and collectively, and come back. Like we use centering, this is a way that we just talk about, like, what does it mean to be in centered relationship, and not as some sort of static thing, but as something to return to, and then approach one another from. But that there is, even when we're moving towards shared political purpose, that we recognize that, like, we're constantly reorganizing ourselves, and that it's something that keeps happening. It's not something, there's no fixed state, there's no healed state. but that there's a constant relationship to what might have happened, and being able to stay in relationship around that. Yeah, I think there's something here about continuity, versus disruption. And then I think that like what it does also pose, though, is that if we're all kind of saying that we're walking through the door, practitioner, or participant, whatever, however we want to define ourselves, that we all are in some ways shaped by traumatic experiences, then it also, the other contradiction is not to create too much of an inclusivity around that, and acknowledge gradations of suffering, of and so I think it's always kind of like this this dance between the particular and then something that we share, so that we can we can keep connecting on that, and move, and then still have a kind of purposefulness around it, a meaning making and a purposefulness that's both individual and collective. But these are I just think they are hard to hold all together all the time, and I think they just constantly slip, and we're finding that, or at least I've found that in just about every space that I've been in.
Sumitra, there's a question that's been +1 in the chat. I don't know if you can see it, about the influence and the simplification of somatics. And maybe while you read that, I'll just say, Cam, towards your question about walking toward trauma, I mean, I think restorative justice is the practice I see that is holding a structural critique, not discarding perpetrators of often heinous and very painful further trauma-ing, but not assuming that you can just separate people from their people and our communities. So I would point towards restorative justice, and it's practiced at lots of scales and lots of places, but as a place very messy and imperfect, but where some of that's being worked out, and it meets the structural critique, say, of abolition, and how that gets enacted in the day-to-day. I don't know if you want to go back to that question, Sumitra, that's in the...
Could you point me to that, Pato?
I'm happy to read it, just so that if
Yes,
people
please.
can't see the chat following along. So it has been +1. It was Brendan's question originally. So could anyone speak a bit about how van der Kolk's influence, or at least as represented in the pop conversations about his book, has seemed to consolidate and simplify what counts as somatic? For instance, the separation of so-called talk therapy from somatic practices, as though speaking and symbolizing weren't somatic practices. And a number of people had said that they would be excited to hear the panel take up this question, if you don't mind.
I'm happy to kick it off, just since Pato, you directed that question earlier to me, but like in somatics really we hold as like a combination of talk and conversation, as well as physical movement and breath, and it's sort of this psychodynamic plus neurobiology kind of mishmash. So a lot of the processes or the containers in which we do the work have that combination implied in them. So I think there's a question, the question is specifically like, what counts as somatics, right? And I think I would say that it's that we hold it as like, well, part of it is that while being able to also feel sensation and connect sensation to narrative or story, as well as emotion, so that we're constantly thinking about the relationship between those things as what our sense of self is, and that it's no one thing, that by being in a kind of healing relationship, you are kind of becoming more aware of the dimensions and how they intersect with one another of thought, emotion, sensation, or the way you carry yourself, and what happens in a kind of moment of automatic reaction or habitual reaction under pressure or stress. So constantly tuning in to that automatic response under pressure, and the kinds of behaviors that, or the kinds of moves that you make as a result of that, and then being able to kind of come back to a more centered re-engagement with oneself and whatever they're relating to. So again, that's like dynamic and not, and imperfect, and necessarily imperfect, so, but it's a way of trying to navigate that. So what counts as somatic? I mean, I don't know if that's sort of partially answers the question in terms of those spaces.
Yeah, I wanted to sort of add to that. I think that like part of this claim that the body keeps the score, or that van der Kolk's sort of idea of the somatic limits or narrows what exactly the somatic is, or what somatic therapy is allowed to be, is in some way like not a misunderstanding of I think some of the stuff that van der Kolk is trying to say, but I might say like a slight misinterpretation maybe of some that he's trying to say, which because essentially what I want to sort of point to is in van der Kolk's writing, he really emphasizes that somatic practice is a necessary part of talk therapy as well. Like it isn't just a sort of separate, and he does talk about it as a separate kind of practice. There are ways that really focus on the body, but he does sort of talk about and discuss how in his own practice and in his own experience with talk therapy, that somatic practice, somatic awareness, being embodied in the space is like a necessary part of the talk therapy itself. And so I think for van der Kolk at least, the separation between what somatic therapy is and what like non-somatic therapy is not actually that clear cut. I think that because of his interest in the mind, the body, and the brain, the way that it gets taken up in this sort of differentiation he makes, and the body keeps the score, tends to separate those two kinds of healing practices. But I actually would sort of argue that van der Kolk is trying to push for talk therapy to not be considered an anti-somatic practice, or like a space where the somatics don't matter, but rather a space where we have to reintroduce somatic experiences and somatic techniques for like calming and breathing, all these different things. Which I just wanted to sort of like connect this briefly back to the conversation we were having before about like community and like relationality. Because like one framework that I think has been really helpful for me thinking about trauma has been, coming from disability studies. And disability has sort of like popped up here and there in the conversation, like as it often does when we talk about trauma. And we could talk about what is trauma's relation to disability? Is trauma a disability? Is trauma something that exacerbates, et cetera, et cetera. But all I wanted to sort of point to is there is a way in disability studies to talk about disability, which is sort of always emphasized that disability is always created in relation. Disability is never something that is inherent to the individual, but always something that is created in relation. And it's not just created in relation in the sense of like the psychological experience of one's disability is changed depending on where you are, but the literal definition of disability, the embodied experience of disability, is also changed in interaction with the world around us. And so I would say the same about trauma. And again, I'm not trying to equate trauma and disability necessarily here, but just to sort of point towards, I think, a similar kind of definition of trauma based on relationality that I would encourage us to think more about and lean into a bit, because it does get towards restorative justice, disability justice, which is linked to restorative justice, I think. And anyway, so this is a collection of thoughts, but I wanted to sort of introduce that as well into this conversation.
Yeah, I can chime into what you're making me think about there. I was just teaching Mara Mills's entry from the keywords in disability studies, where she's talking about the definition that's so much of it rests on infrastructure and architecture, and so it's like whether the society is built in a way, both socially, relationally, and materially, that constructs experiences of disability. The but I wanted to kind of just say a few things about the separation of talk therapy and somatic practices, because I think I agree with you, Angelica, that I think what happens is the body keeps the score is such a good slogan that and I appreciate the framing of the question, because it's that parentheses, at least as represented in pop conversations, because I think the representation of the book in pop conversations has probably got a fair amount of distance from the multiplicity that's held in the book, and the multiplicity of approaches and the ways he's, at least in my experience of it, really just trying to say, being like, okay, rhythmic movement here. Okay, with EMDR, I learned the lesson that like in that context, I turns out I have a habit of reaching for patients' stories, and in that context, they don't need to voice it in language in order for the treatment to be effective. Like that was something I was kind of trained into and habituated into, but they don't owe me that and they don't need it for their recovery. But then in other contexts, putting the thing into language in order to feel heard is really fundamental. So I wonder if maybe it would go back to his emphasis on action and agency, and completing, like one understanding of trauma as kind of something that's incompleted or interrupted. And so there's some emphasis on completion. And that language, so it had me thinking on this read about like how and when is language experienced as action? Is it ever not action? Like I think those are some of the things that question made me bring up, or made me think of. And I'm also thinking about this question of disturbance, assuming a baseline or norm that Pato raised. And one question I've had about that is the relationship between baseline and norm. And then in somatics, there's and you named it, Sumitra, the centering, like a notion of a central or a center or a neutral position that a practitioner wants to kind of ground themselves in or hold in order to hold space for someone else. And that it's more kind of a question I've had for a while. And I'm feeling like something between those two, like the problems of assuming baseline and norm and what gets enacted in that assumption. And then this kind of, and maybe centering is really importantly different as a word than baseline. And I really liked that you talked about the returning to it, like it's a dynamic returning. But yeah, just some curiosities. Oh my God, there's so much in the chat. Okay, I'm gonna pause now.
Can I just add in Emily's question as we keep here, because it's a kind of continuing on, but a really beautiful framing, I think. So Emily, I'll read it if that's okay. So follow on what Angelica just said. Some of the talks have touched on how trauma, or perhaps more correctly, a faulty conversation on trauma and resilience, can elide a social condition, and in other cases, it can elide a biological condition. This is certainly true in the history of women's health and trans healthcare, and in the diagnosis and treatment of chronic illness, which has been a massive conversation, right, recently. So when it comes to our political work, how do we demand recognition and care along these other lines without dismissing trauma? And what are some tactics for honoring and addressing both in our movements?
I'll just jump in quickly and use COVID as a way to think, not necessarily as the answer, but because all kinds of people have been impacted by COVID, and because much of the first wave in the US and Canada was privileged folk, right, who had been able to travel or have contact at conferences, etc. Not only, but many of the first wave, there were a fair number of scientists and doctors that got infected, as well as activists and organizers. And so people who were in active professional relation. And because there was so much gaslighting on the one hand and miscomprehension, just lack of knowledge on the other, inside of many medical systems, what the COVID movement, some parts of the COVID movement have taken up as patients. That term is often debated in social justice movements, but those impacted in their own bodies and together by the virus very early on started leading research when the social sciences and the hard sciences had a paucity of available knowledge about this new coronavirus. So that initiative called patient-led research said, we have knowledge in real time. Trauma's not back there that's now popping up. It's right here. I can barely get out of bed, but I might know how to like frame a question that's less biased, and you might know how to distribute it to networks. And together as a collective in real time, this is March, April, May, June of 2020, we can create this survey initially for us, those impacted, but really to build a knowledge base that isn't necessarily anti-peer review or existing journals or literature at all. It just is trying to move in real time. So it's this hybridization of activism and the rigors of science and scholarship. And the collective itself had a variety of people engaged, and that allowed for this kind of productive tension. So disturbing the disturbance. And that body of knowledge has over time been proven out by other studies that could be slower or more rigorous, look at the different waves. And so I bring that up because that became a way to advocate for patients' rights and needs, to lobby the CDC for a designation of COVID as a disability, which meant it could then be tracked inside health systems, right? And therefore you could mobilize resources around it. It gave impacted people a sense that, wait a minute, I'm not alone. There's like something that's got like hundreds into the thousands of people responding. It's aggregating knowledge, right? And so it's this complicated moment that I don't think we've really seen before, where it's like social media hive meets like activist cell meets having some of the tools and the frameworks that you need in order to assess something as complex as COVID's impact on the body. So I use that as a way to try to address your question, Emily, about how do we shape our activism, because that is impacting everything from mutual aid efforts up to policy and resource flows, as well as research agendas themselves. I don't want to at all suggest that that's can be applicable to many other kinds of traumas and temporal frames of traumas where we are dealing with centuries-old traumas, for instance. But it's one thing that I've been trying to learn a lot from, about how people in real time mobilize something when the expected, it's hard to believe, systems couldn't or wouldn't, but didn't stay disconnected from the systems. That's the difference, I think. It wasn't simply separatist.
One thing that sort of immediately comes to mind for me with this is I think one thing that trauma can sort of give us, or at least remind us of, or something that we can carry as we are looking at all these other things that we want to, create a movement or a collective action around. I think that trauma sort of emphasizes the need for us to look directly and understand and give power and understand the power of felt and lived experiences, even as we are thinking about structures of violence. Because I think that there is a tendency in moving to thinking about structures, which is, completely, I understand the move. If we are sort of looking at the fundamental cause of violence or whatever, structures of inequality, structures of poverty, structures of racism, all of these things shape that and are important for that. But I do think that trauma takes so seriously the sort of on the ground, felt, lived conditions, the lived experiences, the ongoing experiences, not just thinking about tragedy or horror or suffering as an event, but also as a sort of ongoing experience of the world and the environment, which I think is really important to sort of name and insist upon, is that these things are not events necessarily. They're often not events, but longer histories. They're part of the environment we live in. But yeah, so I think that this is sort of what I want to sort of, I guess, say that trauma gives us or emphasizes, and I'm going to give it with a little anecdote that I think often trauma scholars forget that they're also looking at structures in the same sort of on that flip side, as we've kind of touched on already. But one thing that immediately came to mind, I had done an interview with some of the principal investigators for the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. And I was asking them, why did you choose to list these particular types of experiences and not other types of experiences in childhood that, for instance, not having access to good healthcare or not having access to a good supermarket or whatever. And one of the things that they said was, well, how do you actually study? They were said in response, how do you actually study the effects of poverty? And I was sort of taken aback by this, because when I assumed that, trauma is trying to look at structures of violence and then place them in the felt lived experience, see them in the felt lived experience of people, and talk about the actual effects that people feel and carry with them going forward. So just to say that I think that structures and felt lived experience are things that the trauma scholars themselves don't always link as much, even if they are linked and you can see it embedded in their work. But then on the vice versa, I think so much of the focus on structural fixing the structural also elides that felt lived experience that trauma really emphasizes is so important for us to remember. So I'll stop for there.
I mean, I can just add, oh, sorry, Carlin, go ahead.
You go, because I was going to look at Emily's response in the chat.
Okay, well, I was just going to riff off the same thing, which is simply saying that, like, yeah, it's just, I agreeing with Angelica and just how much it is that sort of doing both is like a really like a huge effort of attention to do both well. So I know that like for those of us who are trying to do the sort of politicized somatics thing, it's like, well, we know that when we're very much in one mode of deeply listening to the lived experiences of people, that that sometimes we're just very much in that mode, and it does, and there are critiques about how that takes away from something that is more sort of that collective subjective will, and like. And I think that tension is always there about how to create enough of a kind of common denominator that still keeps tactically, pushing for what it means to really deeply listen to people's bodies and lived experiences. So how do we keep incorporating that? If there is any integration, how do we really incorporate a deeply listening to lived experiences into that sort of shared collectivity that wants to reorganize the structures. So there's that. And I think that there's also plenty of examples in the other direction where it's like there is a kind of, I mean, some of this is about this sort of irrationality of our bodies fitting in these rational discourses that are about having to, rationalist materialist discourses that are about like organizing the subjective will to rearrange material conditions, and then we've got those where we're all just like kind of messy and fallible and like and yes, traumatized, potentially in gradation and specifically. So it says how to sort of acknowledge that range is hard, but we don't want to give up on either thing, obviously, I think, because we want to reorganize the way the entire shit works. But yeah, I think that and just another thing that Carlin had said around just the centering, this kind of sense of like, oh, is there a baseline? Because I think it relates to this too on some level. I think that the center itself for everybody can be different. It's like we have this sort of vague kind of center of gravity, not vague. We have a center of gravity practice. We have a kind of a at your core centering practice, that a place to come back to, a kind of home base. But that ends up being the thing that you yourself find as whatever can give you a kind of home base, and that can shift. But it's about like slow work, trying to feel for, listen for, and find that. And it can, and knowing that it's not always available, and that's where also relationality can, and that we want our relationships to be the places also we can lean into when the center just eludes us. So anyway, that's I think just that piece to riff on, in terms of just like it's almost like it feels just really monumental to hold it all in like one kind of fisheye. But when it feels often so contradictory as we work together to try to change things. Yeah, but listening to the body's specifically, our body specifically. I think it's an important opening in our moment, like with whatever other contradictions are around trauma and resilience and all of that. Like, I think there is a real opening here about what it means to listen to our bodies and integrate that that all the dovetailing with disability justice, restorative justice, transformative justice is doing to get us to kind of like shift the way we actually even organize.
I know, Hannah, I got your little note. I'm looking at the time and we have to wrap up. So I'll just very quickly say the thing I was going to say before, which is Emily pointed to the fact that there's wisdom in other traditions of healing. And I actually think a lot of the things that van der Kolk kind of names and is like very new to are other traditions of healing. And so and I think this is pretty common with pop science books in the US. They're often written by white authors. They're often written by male authors. And they're also, James Nestor's Breath is another example of a book that does this, that's like brings forward with more and often less citation practices that have deep indigenous roots, either in this continent or have roots in Chinese medicine. So one example is craniosacral therapy and the kind of vagal theory that's discussed in the book actually has its roots, like the first, the developer of osteopathy was working with indigenous people in the United States. And then that tradition gets kind of formalized by a number of men and all of that. But so that I think it's actually that it's not that is not there. It's the way that gets communicated, and then often what gets left out of the communication is kind of like Western science trying to undo parts of itself that need undoing, and but still being so caught up in its own discursive habits. Maybe would be a way to put it.
Thank you so much to everyone for joining, for our 4 amazing panelists. We are going to, I believe we'll be able to post the video later. This is our YouTube channel where almost all of our videos go. They have transcripts and captions. If you need anything else, you can email us at the foundation. Thank you so much for joining. And we hope to see you soon, maybe in March, or for the repair seminar, which will take up a great deal of this material at length. Thank you all. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you.